morning, everybody. My name is Matt Cook, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Center for Healthy Churches. Let me welcome you to the Changing Church webinar. This webinar is designed to help ministers and congregations ask really important questions about how we do the adaptive work that we need to do in the 21st century. In just a second, I'm going to turn over the hosting responsibilities to Jim Kitchens. Before I do, I wanted to thank all of the various organizations that helped make this webinar a reality. Speaking of Jim Kitchens, we're grateful for the good work of New Matrix, ably led by Jim and Deborah Wright. We're grateful for the good work of the Church Network. Their CEO, Phil Martin, is on with us this morning, for Baptist News Global, for Seminary and the Church Network, for Gardner Webb Divinity School, for the Presbyterian Foundation, all of whom church-facing organizations trying to help churches in a variety of ways. Our organization, Center for Healthy Churches, does that kind of work as well. So grateful for them. With that little bit of an introduction, let me turn over the hosting responsibilities to Jim.
Hey, thank you, Matt. One of the things that New Matrix has done over time, and Deborah Wright is really taking the lead on this for us now, is to work with a lot of smaller churches who are trying to decide what's their faithful future and how do they remain viable in a rapidly changing church culture. And so we decided to have this series on the smaller church, not only to talk about issues they need to be thinking about, but also gifts they bring to the church as a whole. And our speaker today, Jeff MacDonald, is really interested in that issue as a part-time minister himself. I think, Jeff, you might be bi or tri or quattro vocational now. I'm not quite sure how many portions you've got. But he served as the part-time pastor at First Parish Church, a UCC congregation in Newbury, Massachusetts, since 2013. And it was out of that experience that he really got interested in how small churches with part-time leadership could actually be maybe even more vital than they were when they were struggling through trying to hold on to a full-time pastor. He's a freelance correspondent for over 25 years, writing for Religion News Service and The Living Church, which is an Episcopal publication. And what got our particularly interested in having him on with us this morning, he's the author of Part-Time is Plenty, Thriving Without Full-Time Clergy, which was published a couple of years ago. And we'll put up the link both to his website and to the book itself in a few minutes. And so, Jeff, we're glad to welcome you to the webinar this morning. Thankful that you're here. Before I pose the first question, I'm going to ask people, because I know there'll be some folks on this webinar who have their own questions for Jeff, who may be part-time pastors themselves or working with churches with part-time ministry. So I want to encourage you to type any questions you have or that come to you as you listen to Jeff in the chat, and we'll try to weave them into the conversation toward the end of our session today. So Jeff, tell us about your becoming First Parish's part-time pastor and how that experience led you to want to do the research that led eventually to this book.
Sure, Jim. Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for being on this call with me and for your interest in this subject. I'm delighted to be part of the small church series with the group here. The way I got to First Parish was that I was going along. I had been a reporter for about 20 years. I started out as a newspaper reporter on staff at a couple of publications, and then I went back to school. I got ordained after 3 years in Divinity School, and I did not give up my journalism, though. I didn't want to do that. So I found a way to keep going with it, and I was doing freelance after I got ordained so that I could serve the church and have more flexibility in my schedule. So I have been a freelance reporter for that amount of time, and I was just going along minding my own business, ordained pastor in the UCC, covering news, filling in on supply ministry, when the church in Newbury reached out to me and said, would you come and do a couple of services for us, because we, after 375 years, we've run out of money and we're going to close. So will you just come and kind of, turn the lights out, basically? And I said, well, I'm really sorry to hear that. I'll help out as I can. And I went and did some services, but found that they actually didn't really want to close. They just thought that was their only option. And they decided to go from full-time to quarter-time in the pastorate, and to do that really without any planning or concept of how they were going to pull it off. But that was all they thought they could afford. And so they said, would you be interested? And I said, well, since I do work already as a reporter and make my living that way, I can do this. And I said, yes. And so we got into it, and I realized, I really wanted to know how to do it well. Especially how would that congregation do it well after being used to depending on a full-time pastor to do so much of the ministry in their setting? And as we tried to find literature on that, we didn't find much. And so didn't really find much of anything. There was a little bit about pastors and how do they kind of balance more than one livelihood, but it was there wasn't much of anything on how does the congregation transition to be effective through a different ministry model. And so in that dearth of material, I decided to start doing research on my own. I proposed a grant, and the grant led to the research that led to the book. And so with that, I can tell you a little bit, if you'd like to hear a little more about how that went. I got this grant in 2016 and had proposed to the BTS Center, who funded it in Portland, Maine. I had proposed to them, I said, let's go out and find the churches that are thriving with part-time ministry, that meet a number of vitality benchmarks, that they have stabilized their finances and then done at least one of several other things like increase mission impact or grow their average Sunday attendance substantially, or have increased member engagement. Those types of vitality benchmarks we were going to bring and say, who's doing better after transitioning? Because certainly financial stability by lowering costs could be in sight, and maybe some of these others could too. Let's go learn from those doing it. And they said, yeah, great idea. Let's go do that. And really one of the first calls I made was to a judicatory staffer in New England. And in the interview, I said, so you have about 40 churches that have part-time pastors. And they said, yes, we do. I said, so can you point me to a couple that are thriving? And they said, no, we can't. I said, why not? They said, well, we don't have any. I said, what do you mean? Out of 40 churches, you don't have even one that's thriving on any of these benchmarks that I'm talking about? And they said, nope. If they were thriving, they wouldn't have part-time clergy. By definition, they must not be a thriving church. So I realized I was up against some sort of catch-22 thinking in this, and it could be an uphill climb. And so I thought there might be some sort of bias toward full-time clergy built into that response that I was hearing. But I also wanted to hear, what she's experienced. So tell me more. What makes you believe this, that it's not possible? And she did explain in a way that really helped set up my research. She said, the reason that churches don't thrive with part-time clergy is because the clergy don't have time to do the things that lead to thriving. They are limited to preparing for and leading worship services and doing pastoral care with a largely aging population in most cases. And that's all they have time to do. So they don't get out into the community. They don't build new relationships. They don't foster new types of mission. They don't find ways for their neighbors to use their gifts. They just don't do the things that lead to a growing dynamic church. And so I was intrigued by that and asked, is she right? Is that really the fate for churches? Maybe this is going to be a kind of a short research project after all. That if she's right, then there isn't really much to write about. And And so I went out kind of with that in mind through the entire research project was, is she right? And indeed, there are a lot of churches that have done exactly what she says, because that's where you end up when you just take a default approach. And it's almost like you take a hatchet to the job description and say, what can we get rid of? Well, we can't get rid of pastoral care, and we got to have somebody up there on Sunday morning, so everything else gets lopped off. Okay, almost like a scissors, like the way Thomas Jefferson went after the Bible when he just pulled his scissors out and eliminated the parts that didn't work for him. This is kind of what churches end up with when they don't approach it with much of a plan. And that, I think, is in the most cases what happens. They just fall into this due to financial constraint, and then they start to figure it out. And a lot of my message is that they can figure it out, and they can do a lot better if they're strategic with it. Even if they weren't strategic going in, they can figure out how to be more strategic in their approach to this. And that's what I found when I did find congregations. Unfortunately, I was able to make more phone calls and find and be pointed to churches that really are thriving with part-time clergy. Several dozen I visited. And so I visited those from all mainline denominations, from rural, suburban, and urban, and around the country, Northwest, Northeast, Mid-Atlantic, Southwest. And what I found was that these churches are mobilizing their people in a different way. They're moving away from sort of a de facto kind of consumer approach to doing church to more of a practitioner approach, where the people begin to see themselves as practitioners. They're not expecting that staff are going to create experiences for them, and then they will show up and provide support by participating, maybe set up a few chairs, maybe wash a few dishes, and do sort of low-level volunteering, but otherwise just show up for things and make their contributions and consider that a dominant kind of model. There's much more of a practitioner orientation, which requires a mental shift in some cases. And I found that some churches that were kind of ready for that were sort of thinking, yeah, of course, we're all ministers, we're all going to be involved in sharing worship leadership, sharing the visitation, sharing the development of programs, sharing the mission organizing. Those that are geared that way have found this to be the easiest. The ones that, but in many cases, there's at least some cultural shift and mindset shift that needs to happen. And so what I've been finding is that churches are strategically kind of repositioning their lay people to be more practitioners and positioning their pastors to be more supportive in a way that local congregation needs. And a couple of the dominant forms that I see that taking is one, what I have described as an equipper model, where the pastor is equipping the congregation to do more of what they used to assume that was the pastor's job, so to speak. An example of this is in St. John's Church in Gloucester, Massachusetts, where they used to depend on the priest to do evangelism, to do all the stewardship campaigns, to do all of the work around adult education. All of that used to be the priest's role. And there they strategically said, we're going to allocate priest time to equipping us to do these things. And so it does take a chunk of time, but the priest will gather a cohort and take them through a study. And at the end of it, they will have people who are ready in both mind and heart to carry the mantle and do these ministries, which then frees the pastor up to, or the priest up to do some other, to kind of float strategically and focus elsewhere. So you see kind of this evolution of a culture. And a second model that I'll mention before opening up for questions maybe is an ambassador model, where sometimes the pastor will describe this. When I interviewed some, they would say, yeah, the lay people in our church basically run the church. That's kind of their shorthand for our lay people know how to do most of these things. Where setting up for worship, doing a lot of the leadership, and even the pastoral care. So you can almost kind of leave the lay people to run the church in a small church setting. In some cases, they're quite used to that. And in one church, they were renting space from, this was a Lutheran church, renting from an Episcopal church. And they said, instead of gathering on our own at 1:00 in the afternoon on Sunday, why don't we just go to the Episcopal service and worship alongside of them? Then our pastor doesn't have to spend so much of his time preparing for worship. He can be part of that sometimes, but he can also be involved in community outreach, which was in a housing project in Tacoma, Washington, where the church was located. And so they've had a tremendous ministry that has been led by the pastor to engage the neighbors, both in food distribution and in organizing these dance ministries that engage the hardest group to reach. Young men between the ages of 15 and 25 turn out 100, 150 for church services that are basically oriented around a dance competition, but it always has scripture, it always has prayer, it always has sermon, and the sermon's always on either mental health issues or conflict resolution, stuff that's very relevant to their lives. And so that's an example. I can give you more examples of either of those models, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions and to hear what types of things you guys are interested in.
Well, let me start. Let me invite you to put your questions you have for Jeff in the chat, and I'll go to them as soon as they appear. But one of the things I'm wondering about, Jeff, is as you did that research, I mean, you found examples, you got referred to churches that were part-time and were thriving. But I wonder, as you sort of have reflected on the churches you've talked to, are there some characteristics that you could kind of said, oh, that's the reason they were able to pull this off? I mean, are there churches that are better equipped to move into this model than others?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was trying to be sensitive to that, where, are we seeing churches where the pastors really just a gifted charismatic person, the rare person who can do this? Is that what we're getting? Or are those just the ones that do it? Or even more of concern would be, are these pastors getting paid part-time and actually working full-time, and just sort of having ministry success, and that's what we have to chalk this up to. So I really asked them all these kind of questions to make sure we weren't going in a misleading direction here. And what I found, for your question, Jim, of what positions them to do this, I think that one important part was that these were congregations where the pastor would give them permission to be more involved in things that they customarily saw as the clergy person's role. And that surprised me a little, because I said, you don't need the pastor's permission to do the ministry of all the baptized, but they, as a function of church culture, they think they do, and they don't want to step on any toes. And so a really key thing here, just even before you get into the actual equipping, like, do you know how to visit somebody in the hospital on behalf of the church? Do you know how to lead someone in prayer? Do you know how to lead a Bible study? Do you know how to prepare a sermon as a lay person that's going to be a faithful proclamation? Do you know how to do these things? Before you even get to any of that, it's is the pastor going to frown on this? And in churches that have where the pastor has had his or her hand in a lot of different things, that's a key area. And if the pastor doesn't proactively say, you're welcome to be involved in these ministries, the people may assume, you know what, we just had to cut our pastor's job down, and now there's a lot of things we just can't do as a church anymore. And I guess that's just our lot in life. We have to live with that almost anemic condition. So I think that's a pretty big factor. Another is there are some basic matters here too, where if the congregation is too small or too aged, they can't do this. You do need to have something of a critical mass. If you have only 4 or 5 people and they're all in their 90s, you can't do what I'm talking about. And so part of this is, one of the learnings here is that if you wait too long, you might not be able to do it. If you do it when it's a bit earlier, then you have much more to work with. And so churches that go from 40 hours a week or a full-time position to 30 can sometimes do this in such a way that the congregation barely even notices. The finances are more stable, and the transition is developing a culture of shared ministry that will serve the congregation well over the long run. But if they start earlier, they do okay. Those that hold on and spend down their endowment, like my church in Newbury, my church in Newbury sold its Paul Revere weather vane for $575,000 to the Museum of Fine Arts and spent that money. And then they came to me and said, "We're broke. Can you do the last couple of services?" And that was all spent on a full-time ministry that really didn't have a lot of strategic vision behind it. It was just thinking that's what we got to do. And if they had gone to a strategic part-time ministry a lot sooner, they would have had a lot more to work with, including more people, younger people, and energy.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Deborah posed a question, just saying that when she's found in her work that when the church makes that transition from full-time to part-time, that it affects their psyche. And I can imagine them saying, well, we're not a real church anymore. Do you have any hints on how to coach a church through that transition? What kind of support do they need?
Yeah, that's a great question, Deborah. And I think helping them see themselves in a bigger context is really important, because they might think, if they think, we're not going to be a real church anymore. I heard those exact words, for instance, at Clarendon Presbyterian Church in Arlington, Virginia. There were lay people who put it in those exact words, that was their fear. And part of how they got to a place of peace with that, and even excitement about the way they're doing church, part of it was that their pastor wanted to do it, and for personal reasons, and that helped in his case, and it encouraged them. They said, well, if the pastor can have a multifaceted life and a multifaceted ministry, then we can too. And so there was that. But in terms of the larger question of how do you coach through that, I think one of the things that can be really helpful is to see the bigger picture, because they might just see their own congregation and their history and saying, well, a couple of decades ago, we used to have full-time and now part-time. I guess that's a step backwards, which I don't believe is true, but it's they might think that, full-time is always better. Having someone do more for you is better than needing to do more yourselves. These are not premises that hold up well, but they can infuse the psyche of congregations. But when they step back and you say, that norm against which you're comparing yourselves is not the dominant norm of Christian history. It's not the dominant norm of the way the church has grown through the centuries and has thrived and has impacted lives and made transformations happen by the power of the Holy Spirit. It hasn't happened in that rubric. The full-time one pastor dedicated to having no other livelihood and serving no other local church isn't how it was done in the ancient world or in the medieval church or in the colonial days. It's much more of a recent phenomenon, of a function of Gilded Age prosperity and a time when religion was a larger part of our wider culture. And so you're comparing yourselves really to an anomaly in history. And when you look back and say, actually, what we're doing now is reclaiming our connection to the dominant way that God has used the church and has used the ministry and continues to do so across the globe, that's very heartening and empowering, I think, when you recognize that, and this has, and to look at immigrant churches, African American churches. We're not kind of heading into uncharted territory here. We're heading into the norm. The anomaly is what your church might have been experiencing 20 years ago. That's the anomaly. This is not. So I think there's value in that.
Right. To use the one pastor, one church model would probably make Anglican priest in Kenya laugh. That idea that they wouldn't have 10 churches to shepherd as a pastor.
Yes.
Yeah. Somebody was asking, because always in budgets, when you look at where the strain on the budget comes, it's personnel and it's building maintenance usually. So Dale was asking, are there some ways that do you have some ideas about ways that we can help people quit focusing on maintaining the dang building and investing that money in people, whether it's the folks you're going to train to begin to do that lay leadership, or just to focus on mission and not on keeping the building going?
Yeah, great and important question. One place where I saw it was interesting in the Disciples of Christ. That is a good place to look. Christian Church Disciples of Christ denomination would be a good place to look, because in their church culture, it's just been one of less connectedness to buildings, and so we've seen more examples of them taking stock and saying, we don't. We're not stuck with this one building, and we can go to a different location. And we've seen a lot of that, where they take stock of what they have to work with, and they will sell their buildings and just go to a different spot. Sometimes go for the sake of being in a better part of the city, where they can do a more effective ministry. And they say, look, we don't need this big building in this non-strategic location. What we need is a smaller building, a more nimble building in a more strategic location. So let's do that. In America, properties are sold often, and let's be one of them who does that. So off they go. That's one of the approaches. There are other places, like I'm United Church of Christ here in New England, and are we going to sell the white church on the town green? That's not usually where my people are thinking about going. So they don't and they often to do it. So they'll do things that look at strategically using their properties and really partnering. It's something I'm talking about with my church right now, is partnering with other organizations so that the property isn't underutilized, isn't an albatross, is an instrument of mission that others can come in and use and even help maintain. I have a great for one church, they've transformed their life just by opening themselves to a Salvadoran Seventh-day Adventist church that worships there on Saturdays. It makes no inconvenience for the people, and many of the folks in the congregation are in the trades in the Salvadoran church. So when the building needs painting, when the roof needs replacing, when the windows need repair, the Salvadorans take great pride in it and do it as part of the partnership. It's totally transformed the financial and ministerial outlook of that congregation. They see themselves as partners in a bigger work of God, and it's fabulous. And they're not drowning under their building expenses anymore. And this is a very small church in Lynnfield, Massachusetts, about 8 miles north of Boston. that can happen in a lot of other places too. There's a lot of things to work with when we open ourselves to partnerships and using the properties. So there's more I could say, but I'll leave it there, I think.
I just want to point to the comment that Deborah made in the chat about churches that make the decision to release that part-time clergy person from doing mostly preaching and maybe live stream in a neighboring church, another pastor whom they admire, and then building their worship service around sharing about that conversation. In particular, I know one church she's thinking about, it came at the behest of their part-time pastor. He said, you don't need a preacher. What you need is a community organizer. Why don't you take that quarter-time salary you're paying me, live stream in that worship service, and then you hire a community organizer to help you figure out what's the mission you're called to do in this community. So just noting that that's also another way to think about it. Another one that we've encountered is large churches being approached by smaller churches, basically saying, here's the deed to our church. Can you do something with a mission outpost, in our suburb near you? And so there are multi-site churches that are growing, that are giving new life to smaller churches, sometimes with full-time leadership, sometimes with part-time. I want to get to Dee Dee Kelso's question before we end, and that was, she was pointing out the same thing you did. This, we're responding to an anomaly, in particularly a post-World War II anomaly, where all the men came back and really wanted to build community, be a part of a community, really came into churches with that, we're going to make this happen. And they also often had wives who were not working outside of the house and who could do a lot of volunteering for the church. And both of those realities have gone away. But her question really out of that is sort of, you were talking about, there's a level that you can get to of decline where it's not really possible to think about the model you're proposing. So she's asking, so how can pastors coach their congregations before they get to that point about taking on more of the ministry themselves? How can they not only equip, but encourage them? Either if they're that pastor who preceded you, who went out the door after Christmas on 2012, or a person who's saying, I'm going to stay here, but I know we need to move me to part-time ministry. So kind of where in that continuum is the sweet spot to begin that coaching and encouragement?
Yeah, a great question, Dee Dee, and great observation about the culture of post-war and gender roles and those dynamics. I totally agree with that analysis. And for what pastors can do in this, it seems that it's very heartening to see some of the forward-looking pastors looking 20 years ahead and saying, even our church where I'm full-time and we have a healthy church, we need to be looking ahead and learning from those that share the leadership more effectively and share the building more effectively. And so I've seen that happening, where the pastors will basically just sort of guide the congregants to embrace a more shared approach, even though they don't have to per se, even though it's not driven by a financial necessity, or it's to help them see that that's a vision consistent with 1 Corinthians 12, where the Spirit is distributed among many members. It's a faithful way of doing church, and we can do it, and so and thrive by doing it. And so I think to open the door again by giving the permissions for people to be part of things, and to say Sunday, but I'd like to develop a cohort. If we have a couple of people who feel called to preach, I'd like to help equip them for that role, and maybe I work with a couple of them and spend a little of my time, instead of preparing to give you the sermon myself, maybe I'll prepare them to be more adept preachers in their own right and use a little of my time for that task. Likewise with Bible study, Christ the King Lutheran Church out in Washington State has done this, and they, instead of the pastor leading the Bible study, a handful of people to do it. So you have small groups led, and the pastor just uses his time that way instead. They started doing that before they had to, per se, and people, those who flourish in that kind of role really welcome it. And so I think that's just forward-looking ministry. It's just a good way of leading people to and helping them see. Require a humble approach on the part of the pastor in this, because the pastor ultimately has to think, I'm not the only one who can do this. I love being needed, but I'm not the only one who can do pretty much almost everything here. There's others who can do almost everything, and doesn't mean everybody can do everything, but that role of lifting up talent is a good ministry in preparation for this.
Okay. All right. I'm going to squeeze in quickly Josh's question. He's a part-time lay pastor in a Presbyterian church in Michigan, about 40 members, shares the building with the preschool and the Seventh-day Adventist congregation, but building and shrinking and aging population of membership is still an issue. So he asked, do you have any insights as it pertains to connecting more to the community and fostering a more viable congregation? So thinking about that missional turn toward the community.
Right. Yeah. As I think there's a real opportunity here where rethinking is not just the pastor's job description, but the whole ministry project in a collaborative manner. When you open the door to say, how could we kind of redistribute the ministry opportunities and roles? So partner with the congregation or with the wider community in some new ways, and and making room for that can be part of this. You'll sometimes see that partnerships that emerge when churches say we'd like to have more uses for our building. Sometimes one of the folks who shares the space and shares the expenses is also offering something that is of value to the congregation and to the wider community. And so you can kind of develop those so that the small church with a limited number of people doesn't have to feel like it has to be the fountain of all programming or spiritual formation. To partner in mission, like the church in Newbury did, can really work. That the church when I was in Newbury, we had that closed and said, we have a food pantry that we don't want to go away. Could you keep it going? We have about 4 or 5 people who come. And at first people on my council said, no, we don't have room for it. And I said, what about 90% of this building that's not being used? Can we, and so it took a little persuading, but they said, okay. It quickly became something and didn't have to do on their own. There were great ecumenical 60 volunteers from a bunch of other churches in the area, and it has become a ministry that now feeds over 300 people a week in this, and it's just building. The community came out of the woodwork to fund it. It was amazing. It just anyway, that's an example, because that's spiritual formation that the congregation doesn't have doesn't have to orchestrate on its own. So I think that's an example.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add one piece to go with that, Josh. And this is a question that I first heard from Jan Edmiston, who's a Presbyterian executive in North Carolina. But it's when you're sitting with your people and you just ask them a simple question: what is breaking Jesus's heart in the city in Michigan? And they kind of know they come up with 5 or 6 things really quickly. And then to ask, and how can we begin to address those needs as a congregation and see that as a vital part of our ministry? So I'd love to continue this conversation for a lot longer. I want to remind you that the link to Jeff's website is in the chat if you want to grab that real quickly. Let me just say something about next week's webinar. We're going to be looking at this issue of part-time ministry, part-time pastoral leadership from the pastor's perspective. And Steve Van Ostran, who is executive minister of the American Baptist Churches of the Rocky Mountains, is going to be our guest. And he's going to be talking about some of the insights that he's developed over working with pastors for a number of years. And he had a recent article, 4 Incarnational Benefits of Bivocational Ministry, where he really wants to lift up the positive aspects of part-time ministry from the pastor's perspective. So, Jeff, let me thank you for your wisdom and your insight, and we want to bless the ministry that you're doing and looking forward to having further conversations along the way. Thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a good weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday.